First Samuel, the way we've outlined the book, we divided it into three major sections. We've said chapters 1 through 8 was about Samuel, 9 through 15 was about Saul, and then starting last week, we started the last section, which is 16 through the end of the book, in chapter 31, and is following David, and that's the section we're going to be in tonight. Still following the story of David all through the rest of 1 Samuel and on through 2 Samuel. We're following the story of David. 1 Chronicles, which we're studying at the same time, we divided into two major sections. We said chapters 1 through 9 were about genealogies, and chapters 10 through 29 is about the reign of David. So if you want to turn to 1 Chronicles 7, we'll go through that rather quickly, and then we'll go to 1 Samuel chapter 21. 1 Chronicles 7, the first 5 verses are just dealing with the family of Issachar. The sons of Issachar were Tola, Puah, Jashub, Shimron, 4 in all. And it lists those through verse 5. Beginning at verse 6, we have the family of Benjamin. And that goes down through verse 12. 13 lists Naphtali. The family of Manasseh on the west of the Jordan is 14 through 19. 20 through 29 is the family of Ephraim. Beginning at verse 30 and going through the end of the chapter in verse 40 is the family of Asher. And so that's the divisions we have in 1 Chronicles chapter 7. The families of Issachar, Benjamin, Naphtali, Manasseh in the west, Ephraim, and the family of Asher. If you want to turn now to 1 Samuel chapter 21, we're covering 21, 22, 23, and 24 this evening. 1 Samuel chapter 21. This is David and the showbread or this consecrated bread here in 1 Samuel chapter 21. Beginning at verse 1, going through verse 9, we have David in the land of Nod. Let's start at verse 1. And David came to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest, and Ahimelech was afraid when he met David and said to him, "Why are you alone and no one is with you?" So David said to Ahimelech the priest, "The king has ordered me on some business and said to me, 'Do not let anyone know anything about the business on which I send you or what I have commanded you, and I have directed my young men to such and such a place. Now therefore, what have you on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread in my hand, or whatever can be found.' And the priest answered David and said, 'There is no common bread on hand, but there is holy bread. If the young men have at least kept themselves from women.' Then David answered the priest and said to him, 'Truly women have been kept from us about 3 days since I came out, and the vessels of the young men are holy, and the bread is in effect common, even though it was consecrated in the vessel this day.' So the priest gave him holy bread, for there was no bread there but the showbread, which had been taken from before the Lord, in order to put hot bread in its place on the day when it was taken away." We'll pick up in verse 7 in just a second. But let's talk about this first section here, or this first division of this, where 1 through 6, we're dealing with David requesting bread. He comes first in verse 1 to the land of Nob, and it is asked of him by Ahimelech, "Why are you alone?" Remember, David is an officer in the army of Saul. He's high up in the army. And so it doesn't make sense that somebody like that would be traveling all alone. There's nobody with him. Why are you by yourself? And so the question is asked of David, and David's answer was that he is sent. He tells him that he was sent on a mission by Saul, which we know was not true. He's fleeing from Saul, what we saw in chapter 20. Remember, when we come to the end of chapter 20, that's where Jonathan goes to Saul at this feast in chapter 20. And, David's gone, and they say, Jonathan tells his father that David's gone to offer a sacrifice. He's asked permission in verse 28 of chapter 20 to go to Bethlehem, to go and offer this sacrifice. And Saul was angry enough with Jonathan that Saul tried to kill his own son in chapter 20. Well, then Jonathan goes and it's reported to David, and David is on the run because he knows Saul is seeking his life. But David tells the priest not that Saul's seeking his life. He doesn't know what's going to happen here if he tells him. So he tells him instead he's on a secret mission for the king. That's why he's by himself. So nobody else is with him. He's supposed to go meet some men somewhere. So that's why David's answer is that he has no supplies. Now, it was that in that time when they would be traveling, when you were in the military, their military, and you're traveling, you would have supplies wherever you were going. So you can wonder here why Ahimelech seems to have some sort of suspicion of what's going on. Because here is a commanding officer who first has no bread with him. He has no food. And second, we'll talk about this in a second, has no weapon. What kind of soldier goes anywhere without his weapon? He's on a mission, supposedly. So he tells Ahimelech he's on this mission, and he asks him, can you give me bread? So Ahimelech's answer was, there's no bread but what here? The holy bread. The bread that was taken, and it's on the table there in the tabernacle, and it was there from the beginning of the week to the end, and then it was taken, and it was to be eaten by whom? The priest. But David says, give me that. He says in verse 5 that truly women have been kept from us about 3 days since I have come out, and the vessels of the young men are holy, and the bread is in effect common, even though it was consecrated in the vessel this day. So David says, well, the bread's common, just give me the bread. The question that always gets raised is David eating the showbread, is it really common and is it okay? Returning to Matthew chapter 12. The question is often raised about this eating of this showbread. Is it okay? Because Jesus alludes to the story in Matthew chapter 12. In Matthew chapter 12, it's recorded, a parallel account is recorded as well in Luke chapter 6, that at that time Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples were hungry and began to pluck heads of grain to eat. And when the Pharisees saw it, verse 2, they said to him, look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath. But he said to them, have you not read what David did when he was hungry, he and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and ate the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only for the priest. So the question is raised, and most will go from 1 Samuel 21 over here to Matthew 12 and say, it's okay for David to eat the showbread. It's okay in situations when it's for a benefit, for things that are law to be set aside. That's a question we've got to raise when we come to 1 Samuel 21. Is what David did okay? Because it's recorded in Scriptures and because Jesus alluded to it, is it okay? Was it okay for him or lawful for him to eat the showbread? Because some will take this passage and try to use it to defend that in certain situations law no longer will apply. So let's explore that question for just a second before we move on in our text. Is it lawful for David to eat the showbread? Let's look at Matthew chapter 12. I want you to notice, and neither in 1 Samuel 21, which we've already read, nor in Matthew 12 or any of the parallel accounts in the Gospels, does Jesus ever say that it was okay for David to eat the showbread. Look again. But he said to them, have you not read what David did when he was hungry, he and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and ate the showbread which was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only for the priest? So never at any point in this text does Jesus say that it was lawful for David to eat the showbread. That in that situation where he's hungry, that he could still violate what the law had stated in order to have food. 1 Samuel 21 does not state that, nor does the parallel account in Luke 6. So number one, it does not mean that we can set aside law when it comes to as some would say, some necessities or things like that, or some would talk about situational ethics. That does not teach us such a thing because Jesus never said it was okay. Number two, not only did Jesus not say it was okay, Jesus called it unlawful. Look again in verse 4. How he entered the house of God and ate the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat. What Jesus just said was it was not lawful when back in 1 Samuel 21, David ate the showbread. Now, Jesus is alluding to a story in Matthew 12. It's important to understand in the context where the apostles had taken in the grain fields, and taken the heads of grain and had eaten them on the Sabbath day. And they were raising a question there in Matthew 12 about about the fact that was wrong. And Jesus is pointing out, you think it's wrong for them just to take the heads of grain and eat the heads of grain and take them off and pluck them off, where it really required no work. But you, because the Pharisees would defend this, you would think it's okay for Jesus over here to have eaten the showbread. Tell me how them plucking the heads of grain, rolling them between their hands and eating it is worse than David having eaten the showbread, which it is expressly stated is not to be eaten. So these texts, neither Matthew 12 nor 1 Samuel 21, recording it, tell us that it is okay for him to have eaten the showbread. I think this brings up an important principle we need to understand. Just because something is recorded in Scripture does not mean that it was approved of. Just because somebody that's a great character of faith has a story recorded about him does not mean the act itself was approved of. We can think of some examples of that. Abraham lied. That was not okay. Noah got drunk. That was not okay. David later on is going to be guilty of adultery, lying, and having a man put to death. That was clearly not okay. Just because the Bible records an event in the life of somebody does not mean that they are condoning that and that they're saying that is okay. So 1 Samuel 21, the question that's always raised when you're going through 1 Samuel 21, was it okay for David to eat the showbread? The text here does not indicate that, and Matthew 12, where Jesus alludes to it, would state that the opposite is true, that it was indeed unlawful. So we need to understand that. As David's coming and he takes the showbread from the priest to eat, it was unlawful for him to eat. It does not mean just because he was hungry, it was okay. It is still a violation of the law that God had given. That's important for us to understand. A violation of the law is a violation no matter the situation you're in. The law that God has given us is still God's law, no matter what the situation may calls for, if you will. No matter what we think the situation is, the law is still the law. Pick up with me in verse 7 now. He's now taken the showbread, but he has another question in verse 7. Now a certain man of the servant of Saul was there that day, detained before the Lord, and his name was Doeg, an Edomite, the chief of the herdsmen who belonged to Saul. And David said to Ahimelech, is there not here on hand a spear or a sword? For I have brought neither my sword nor my weapons with me, because the king's business required haste. Again, if a soldier was going out on the king's business, it might have required haste. But if he's leaving quickly, he would have had enough time to grab his sword if it's really that important that he has one. Because if he gets there without a sword, so this is raising suspicion to Ahimelech. You already know back at the beginning, he's already by himself. He has no food and he has no sword. Verse 8. Required haste. Verse 9. So the priest said, the sword of Goliath, the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah, there it is, wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you will take that, take it, for there is no other except that one here. And David said, there is none like it. Give it to me. And so he goes and he requests the bread, and he's given the showbread, this holy or consecrated bread, and then he's given the sword of Goliath while he's here in the land of Nob. Beginning of verse 10 and going through verse 15, he is before Achish, king of Gath. Then David arose and fled that day before Saul, and went to Achish, the king of Gath. And the servants of Achish said to him, is this not David, the king of the land? Did they not sing of him to one another in dances, saying, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000? We saw that last week. Now David took these words to heart, and was very much afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. So he changed his behavior before him, pretended madness in their hands, scratched on the doors of the gate, and let his saliva fall down on his beard. Then Achish said to his servants, look, you see this man is insane. Why have you brought him to me? Have I need of a madman that you have brought this fellow to play the madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house? So here David's before Achish, and they know here in Gath who David is. Notice what they say about him. In verse 11, David, the king of the land. You know, at this point, David may not be ruling as king. Saul's still ruling as king. But people are beginning to know that David is going to be the next king. That David has been anointed king because the people here of Gath called David the king of the land. They know about David's reputation and what was sung about him back in, I believe it's chapter 18. Saul has slain thousands, and David his 10,000s, verse 7 of chapter 18. They know about that. Then you come down into verse 12. In verse 13, he's afraid now in verse 12, so he pretends to be a madman. Achish says, what need do I have for this madman? So he lets him go. He feared no more because he was let go. Because Achish thought, here's a madman. What do you bring him to me for? This is the next king. He's a madman. He's scratching at the floor. Scratching at the door. He's letting his saliva is coming down his beard. It just seems like like he's mad. So they had him leave. Verse 1 of chapter 22 is where we'll see that. 22, this is going to be where Saul's going to slay the priest. Picking up in verse 1, David therefore departed from there and escaped the cave of Adullam. So here in chapter 22 opens, he's been before Achish, king of Gath, when 21 closes. Here in chapter 22, he leaves and departs from there and escapes to the cave of Adullam. So when his brothers and all his father's house heard it, they went down to him. And everyone who was in distress, everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was discontented gathered to him. So he became captain over them, and they were about 400 men with him. So when David leaves here, in the previous chapter, what do we know? How many people are with him? What does it say? He's what? He's by himself. And now, how many people are following here in chapter 22? How many have come to him? He's got 400 men. We're going to see that number continue to grow as we move through the chapters. But there's the people who are starting to follow David. So he's got 400 men following him. So David goes there to Mizpah of Moab, verse 3. We're looking at some of the journeys of David here, 1 through 5, as he's trying to get away from Saul. And he said to the king of Moab, we're halfway through verse 3, Please let my father and mother come here with you till I know that what God will do for me. So he brought them before the king of Moab, and they dwelt with him all the time that David was in the stronghold. So now he takes his family and he brings them to the king of Moab. Can let them stay here with you. Well, David doesn't know what's going to happen next. He's been anointed king, but he doesn't know. He's having to constantly journey, travel from Saul. He asks the king of Moab, let them stay here with you. They are allowed to stay there. So in verse 5, the prophet Gad said to David, Do not stay in the stronghold. Depart and go to the land of Judah. So David departed and went into the forest of Hereth. So the prophet comes to him and says, you need to get out of the stronghold, you need to get out of the land of Moab and go to Judah. So there he goes to Hereth. And we'll pick up with him here in just a moment at the end of this text. But let's talk about Saul having the priest killed. In verse 6, Saul heard that David and the men who were with him had been discovered. Now Saul was staying in Gibeah under a tamarisk tree in Ramah, with his spear in his hand and his servants standing about him. Then Saul said to his servants who stood with him, Hear now, you Benjamites, will the son of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards and make all of you captains of thousands and captains of hundreds? All of you have conspired against me, and there is no one who reveals to me that my son has made a covenant with the son of Jesse, and there is no one of you who is sorry for me or reveals to me that my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in wait as it is this day. You see, Saul in this situation does not see the situation he's in clearly. How has David treated Saul to this point? What has David done against Saul to this point? Nothing. We're going to talk about another example of that here later in chapter 24 and another one next week. But David's been nothing but respectful to Saul. But Saul is jealous because he knows David's the next king. So how does Saul view David? He's a threat. He's the threat to take the throne. He views David as the enemy. And here now he's found out somehow that Jonathan has made a covenant with David, and he's very angry. He looks at the men about him. Hear now, you Benjamites, will the son of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards and make you all captains of thousands and captains of hundreds? He's basically playing on their emotions here. Like, listen, do you really think the son of Jesse is going to give you the positions that I'm willing to give to you? They're Benjamites, just like Saul is. He'll give them position. Do you really think David's going to give you position? Yet in all this, you're conspiring against me, he tells them. All of you, verse 8, have conspired against me. There is no one who reveals to me that my son has made a covenant with the son of Jesse. And then he says, Jonathan was stirring up my servant, talking about David, against me to lie in wait as it is this day. Now not only is David the enemy, Jonathan's stirring David up, according to Saul. That's how Saul is viewing the situation. Saul says, here's David. David's trying to take the throne from me. But at the same time, not only is David trying to take the throne, here's Jonathan over here, and Jonathan is stirring David up to do so. Jonathan, he's blaming Jonathan here as well. He's still angry, probably going back to what we saw a couple of chapters earlier, still angry with Jonathan. Remember he tried to kill him? Back in chapter 20. But then in verse 9, Doeg the Edomite, we heard from him last chapter. He was in verse 7, he was there in the land of Nob when David was there. Then Doeg the Edomite, who was set over the servants of Saul, and said, I saw the son of Jesse going to Nob, to Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub. And he inquired of the Lord for him, gave him provisions, and gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine. Now, from Doeg's standpoint, this really is how it looked like. Remember, Ahimelech does not know why David's really on the run. And that's going to become an important fact in a second in their defense before Saul. Ahimelech does not know that David is on the run for Saul. What does Ahimelech think David is doing? From chapter 21. What's David telling? He's on a secret mission for the king. So from Doeg's standpoint, it seems like a known fact. Well, David's on the run from Saul, and so from back here, when he sees things, they are sort of aiding and abetting David as he comes into Nob, and they bless him, and they give him provisions, and they inquire of the Lord for him, and they give him a weapon. Ahimelech didn't know what was going on. That's going to be important in a second. Not to say Ahimelech would not have helped David if Ahimelech knew what was going on. But in verse 11, the king calls to Ahimelech the priest, the son of Ahitub, and all the father's house of the priests who were in Nob, and they all came to the king. And Saul said, Hear now, son of Ahitub. He answered, Here I am, my lord. Then listen to what Saul says in verse 13. Why have you conspired against me, you and the son of Jesse, and that you have given him bread and a sword, and have inquired of God for him, that he should rise against me to lie in wait as it is this day? Why are you helping him to defeat me? That's what Saul's thinking they're doing. So here's Ahimelech's answer. He answered the king, said, And who among all your servants is as faithful as David, who is the king's son-in-law, who goes at his bidding and is honorable to your house? Did I then begin to inquire of God for him? Far be it from me. Let not the king impute anything to his servant, or to any in the house of my father, for your servant knew nothing at all of all this, little or much. Here Saul brings an accusation against Ahimelech. You're helping David conspire against me. What's Ahimelech's response? I didn't know he was on the run. But then again, aside from that, who in the house of Saul, who of all the servants of Saul, is even more faithful than David? He's the king's son-in-law. He goes here or there, wherever the king demands. If it wasn't for the fact David was anointed to be the next king, he probably would have been Saul's favorite servant. Whatever the king demanded, David would do. But Saul is blinded by jealousy and he sees David as a threat to his throne. So here's Saul's response. He looks at Ahimelech and says, You shall surely die, Ahimelech, you and all your father's house. Verse 17, I think this is important. The king turns to the guards who stood about him, Turn and kill the priest of the Lord, because their hand also is with David, and because they knew when he fled and did not tell it to me. He turns to them and says, Kill the priest, because the priests are conspiring with David. But what do the guards do? They don't kill him. They don't do anything. I'm going to tell you something about the servants that often goes overlooked. The servants understood these were the priests in service to God, and they were not about to lift their hands against the priest. Even on the command of the king, they understood the priest and the roles the priest played, and they were not about to lift their hands to kill the priest. But guess who's willing to? Verse 18, the king says to Doeg, you turn and kill the priest. And guess what Doeg does? So Doeg the Edomite turned and struck the priest and killed all that day 85 men who were in an ephod. Also Nob, the city of the priest, they struck with the edge of the sword both men and women, children and nursing infant, oxen and donkeys and sheep with the edge of the sword. Saul is so blinded by jealousy for David, he goes and he has the priest of the Lord killed. He has the priest killed because he thinks they were conspiring with David. They helped him. They were letting him go, even though that they knew, that's what Saul thought. They knew what he was doing, but they still helped him. He doesn't listen to Ahimelech's reasoning. Instead, he just has him killed. I admire the courage of the servants who would not lift the sword against the priest. Now in verse 20 through 23, we have Abiathar, the son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, or Ahimelech, the son of Abiathar. Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled after David. And Abiathar told David that Saul had killed the Lord's priests. So David said to Abiathar, I knew that day when Doeg the Edomite was there, that he would surely tell Saul, I have caused the death of all the persons of your father's house. Stay with me, do not fear, for he who seeks my life seeks your life, but with me you shall be safe. And so here, Abiathar joins David here in verses 20 through 23. David is blaming himself because if he hadn't gone to the priest, then the priest would still have been alive because Saul would not have killed them, because Saul killed them thinking they were helping David. He also knew about Doeg that he would tell Saul what was taking place that day. Chapter 23. David continues on the run from Saul. It's really what 23 and 24 are going to be focused on as David is running from Saul. Beginning of verse 1, this is where David is going to deliver Keilah. Then they told David, saying, look, the Philistines are fighting against Keilah, and they are robbing the threshing floors. Therefore David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I go and attack these Philistines? And the Lord said to David, go and attack the Philistines and save Keilah. But David's men said to him, look, we are afraid here in Judah. How much more then if we go to Keilah against the armies of the Philistines? Then David inquired of the Lord once again, and the Lord answered him and said, arise, go down to Keilah, for I will deliver the Philistines into your hand. And David and his men went to Keilah and fought with the Philistines, struck them with a mighty blow, and took away their livestock. So David saved the inhabitants of Keilah. So David, it's important in this section, you just read here and you think David goes to Keilah and he saves them from the hands of the Philistines. It's important to understand that David does something twice before he goes down, and what is that? He inquires of the Lord. He inquires of the Lord. David wants to make sure before he goes down that the Lord is okay with this. Are you okay with me going down and saving what's going to happen if I go down here to the city of Keilah? It's important to understand that those in the Bible that have a great faith need to inquire of the Lord. I can think of an occasion where somebody didn't. There are a few occasions, but I can think of the occasion back in the book of Joshua where they did not inquire of God when those that came to them said they were from a faraway country. They did not inquire of God, and in the end, they made a treaty with those they should not. But here David does not sit back on his hands. He hears Keilah is under attack. The first thing he does is he goes and he inquires of God. The men that are with him are still afraid. We're afraid being here in Judah. What about if we go and we have to actually fight the Philistines? So he inquires of God again. That should bring them comfort. Now he's inquired of the Lord twice, and the Lord has told them twice, go and fight and defend Keilah. And he will deliver the Philistines into their hands, and so they did. But in verse 6, it happened that when Abiathar, the son of Ahimelech, fled to David at Keilah, that he went down with an ephod in his hand, and Saul was told that David had gone to Keilah. So Saul said, God has delivered him into my hand, for he has shut himself in by entering a town that has gates and bars. Keilah is a fortified city, and so Saul thinks this is great. David's put himself in a situation where, because it's got the walls, it's got the bars, he can't escape me this time. So Saul called all the people of war together to go down to Keilah to besiege David and his men. By the way, this is interesting. I don't know what the army of Saul totaled, but David is being followed here by a few men. And when it comes time for Saul to come out and to fight against him, he gathers together all the men of war to go out and siege Keilah. That has to tell us something about how much he wanted to pursue David. He was going to take his entire army to go siege the city of Keilah and to take David captive, or to take David and kill him and defeat his army. When David knew, verse 9, that Saul had plotted against him, he said to Abiathar the priest, bring the ephod here. Then David said, O Lord God of Israel, your servant has certainly heard that Saul seeks to come to Keilah to destroy the city for my sake. Will the men of Keilah deliver me into his hand? Will Saul come down as your servant has heard? By the way, it's an important fact again. What's David doing here before he makes any decision? He's inquiring of God. This shows us about the faith of David. He keeps inquiring of God before making important decisions. He wants to understand now, is Saul coming down? O Lord God of Israel, I pray, tell your servant. Here's what the Lord tells him in verse 11. He will come down. Saul is coming down. So verse 12. Will the men of Keilah deliver me and my men into the hand of Saul? And the Lord said, they will deliver you. So David and his men, listen, about 600. He's now up to 600 men. We just saw him with 400 last chapter. He's up to about 600 now. Arose and departed from Keilah and went wherever they could go. Then it was told Saul that David had escaped from Keilah, so he halted the expedition. And David stayed in the strongholds in the wilderness and remained in the mountains in the wilderness of Ziph. Saul sought him every day, but God did not deliver him into his hand. Saul decided not to halt the expedition to go to Keilah, but he continues to pursue David. He's pursuing him day after day. He wants to make sure he catches David. Verse 15 through 18, we have Jonathan coming to David. So David saw that Saul had come out to seek his life, and David was in the wilderness of Ziph in a forest. Then Jonathan, Saul's son, arose and went to David in the woods and strengthened his hand in God. And he said to him, do not fear, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find you. You shall be king over Israel, and I shall be next to you. So the two men made a covenant before the Lord, and David stayed in the woods, and Jonathan went to his own house. Let's talk about this for just a second. The statement in verse 16, he strengthened his hand in God, or encouraged him, the footnote of the New King James says. It's important to understand, here is Jonathan, and as much as we can say negative about Saul, we can say just as much positive about his son. Jonathan's a good man. Jonathan understands that David is to be the next king. In fact, I think this helps us appreciate even more the friendship that Jonathan had with David, and Jonathan's understanding of the Lord's will is the fact that if Saul's line was to stay on the throne, Jonathan would be the next king. We're not talking about Jonathan's brothers being king and him being, I'd rather it be David than my brothers. Jonathan would be the next king. And Jonathan's not out there with Saul pursuing him. Instead, Jonathan says, listen, you will be the next king and I will be by your side. Now we know, unfortunately, that does not happen as Jonathan dies in battle before he could be by the side of David and David takes the throne. But we need to understand this. Jonathan understood the will of the Lord to the point that he was going to follow David as king, even though it meant he would never sit on the throne. That tells us something about Jonathan. But it's important to understand in verse 16 that here's this man, this righteous man, he's coming to David and he strengthens or encourages his hand in God. You know, when we're around those that we're close to, those that are faithful Christians, that we're friends with, that we're close to, we encourage and we strengthen one another. Just as Jonathan did for David here. That tells me the importance of being around those of a like precious faith. We can be friends with those of the world. We can be around those of the world. And we may have a good time, but they can't strengthen our hand in God like those that are servants of God. No matter what those of the world may do in a friendship, they can't strengthen or encourage our hand in God. They can't make us spiritually better. Because they're not going to be with us and encourage us they may not encourage us to do the right thing, or teach us the message and preach about God's Word, or talk about spiritual things with us, at least not to the extent that those that are Christians would. But those that are faithful Christians and our friends can strengthen our hand in God, just like Jonathan does for David here. And it tells us the importance of being around those that are Christians, and being around those who will encourage and lift us up, even in the face of difficult times. David's on the run. Whatever situations we may come to, whatever may happen in life, we need to understand this. It can't be quite to the extent of what David's having to go through. David's had to flee his homeland. David is on the run from Saul. He's being pursued day after day. Remember last week he said he didn't know when he would die because here Saul is pursuing him. Back in chapter 20, remember the statement in chapter 20? Where he talks about there is only a step in verse 3 between me and death. And that's the way David's had to live these last however long much time has passed. But when Jonathan comes, it strengthens and encourages his hand in God. It can give him some confidence. Jonathan's explaining, telling him, listen, God has said you'll be the next king. You will be the next king. And I'll be by your side. Understand that the Lord's will come about, and He said you'll be the next king. You'll sit on the throne. And so we can be encouraged and strengthened by those of a like precious faith, even in situations where things seem difficult. Beginning of verse 19 and going through the end of this text, David continues to pursue Saul. Or Saul continues to pursue David again, rather. This is the time where we have Saul's men on one side of the mountain and David's on the other. But Saul's called away to battle against the Philistines. And so he's not able to overtake David. 1 Samuel 24, real quickly. David spares Saul's life. This is the first time. It's going to happen again. We'll see that next week. This is the first time that David is going to spare the life of Saul. Here's where David spares Saul's life, is verses 1 to 7. Now it happened when Saul had returned from following the Philistines. Chapter 23 has ended with him pursuing the Philistines. That it was told him, saying, take note, David is in the wilderness of En-Gedi. Then Saul took 3,000 chosen men from all Israel and went to seek David and his men on the rocks of the wild goats. So he came to the sheepfolds by the road, and there was a cave, and Saul went in to attend to his needs. David and his men were staying in the recess of the cave. Then the men of David said to him, this is the day of which the Lord said to you, behold, I will deliver your enemy into your hand, that you may do to him as it seems good to you. And David arose and secretly cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Now it happened after that David's heart troubled him because he had cut Saul's robe. And he said to his men, the Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my master, the Lord's anointed. Stretch out my hand against him, seeing he is the anointed of the Lord. So David restrained his servants with these words and did not allow them to rise against Saul. And Saul got up from the cave and went on his way. I'll say, let's talk about this real quick. Let's talk first and foremost about the self-control of David. If you're being pursued by somebody who's seeking your life, and they're clearly going to kill you if they get a hold of you. I mean, remember, Saul has continuously tried to pin David to the wall with a spear. He sent men to David's house to get him, and David had to flee. He's tried to corner him. He had the priest killed because if he had the priest killed, let's think about this for a second. He had the priest killed because he thought they helped David. What's he going to do to David when he gets a hold of him? And here is Saul in the cave, and David has the chance to kill him. The men are telling him they're with David, David, here's your chance. The Lord has delivered your enemy into your hand. Not only does David not kill him, when David cuts off the corner of his robe, it bothered David that he raised his hand at all against the Lord's anointed, even to cut off the corner of his robe. That tells us something about the character of David. How many of us could be in the face with a person that's actively pursuing, trying to kill us, sitting right there, have the opportunity to do something, and we feel guilty just because we cut off the corner of their robe? That's how David felt. And so Saul gets up and he leaves the cave, and beginning at verse 8, we have two speeches, really, that are given. This is the conversation. 8 through 15 is David's speech, and 16 through the end of the chapter is going to be Saul's speech that they give here, this conversation back and forth. Begin with me at verse 8. David also rose afterward, went out of the cave, and called out to Saul, saying, my Lord the king. And when Saul looked behind him, David stooped with his face to the earth and bowed down. Something real quick here as a side note. Here's somebody trying to pursue and to kill him, and David is still showing him respect as the king. And David said to Saul, why do you listen to the words of the men who say, indeed, David seeks your harm? Look this day, your eyes have seen that the Lord delivered you today into my hand in the cave, and someone urged me to kill you, but my eye spared you. And I said, I will not stretch out my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. Moreover, my father, see the corner of your robe in my hand. For in that I cut off the corner of your robe and did not kill you, know and see there is neither evil nor rebellion in my hand, and I have not sinned against you, yet you hunt my life to take it. Let the Lord judge between you and me, and let the Lord avenge me on you, but my hand shall not be against you. As the Proverbs of the ancient says, wickedness proceeds from the wicked, but my hand shall not be against you. After whom has the king of Israel come out? Whom do you pursue? A dead dog, a flea? Therefore let the Lord be judge, and judge between you and me, and see and plead my case, and deliver me out of your hand. You know, David stands there, and there's Saul, and Saul has been told by those around him. Saul has this misconstrued idea that David is trying to kill him. He's trying to take the throne by force. And here he's standing there, and can you imagine being Saul for just a second? Is David standing at a distance, and he holds up a piece of the corner of Saul's robe and says, the Lord has delivered me in your hand, this is your robe. And Saul probably looks down and sees the corner missing. And you have to think, if you're in Saul's position there, that here you thought this man was going to kill you. He had the chance to kill you. Clearly, he cut off the robe and you didn't even know it. But he spared you. David says, let the Lord judge between us. I'm not going to avenge myself of you, but let the Lord be the judge. I'm not going to raise my hand against you, but let the Lord be the judge. He's leaving it to the hands of God. Now listen to verse 16 about Saul's response, and then we'll talk about some practical lessons from this text. So it was when David had finished speaking these words to Saul that Saul said, is this your voice, my son David? And Saul lifted up his voice and wept. Then he said to David, you are more righteous than I, for you have rewarded me with good, whereas I have rewarded you with evil. And you have shown this day how you have dealt well with me, for when the Lord delivered me into your hands, you did not kill me. For if a man finds his enemy, will he let him get away safely? Therefore may the Lord reward you, with good for what you have done to me this day. And now I know indeed that you will surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in your hand. Therefore swear now to me by the Lord that you will not cut off my descendants after me, and that you will not destroy my family from my father's house. So David swore to Saul, and Saul went home, but David and his men went to the stronghold. Saul looks now and understands, David, you're more righteous than I. I've been pursuing you and trying to kill you for something you're not even willing to do, and you had the opportunity. Who would let their enemy escape, but you let me live? Surely you will be king. Just promise me you're not going to cut off my descendants. And David swore that he would not. Let's talk about some practical lessons. What are some practical lessons we see in this text? Or these chapters? The Lord takes care of His own. David, there were many opportunities where it surely looked like Saul was going to have David. On both sides of the mountain. Here he's in the city of Keilah. And talked about the fact that he pursued him day after day, or every day in verse 14, but God did not deliver him. God took care of David. What else do we see? Right. Situation doesn't determine what the law is and doesn't supersede it. It doesn't matter what the situation is. It doesn't matter how right or wrong it may seem. Think about when you come later on in the 2 Samuel. In 2 Samuel chapter 6, when they're taking out the ark and Uzzah reaches out to touch the ark, it surely seemed like a good thing to do, to hold it still, but the command of God was not to touch it. And he was going to be struck dead, and we'll see that when we get to 2 Samuel chapter 6. The situation does not determine the ethics or law. What else? Vengeance belongs to the Lord. That's a good point. Here David says he's leaving it to the Lord. Everything Saul has done, but he's leaving it to God. How many people would seek vengeance? And Saul even understood that. How many would have the opportunity to kill their enemy? But David understood that vengeance was the Lord's, and he was leaving it up to God. I think it's important to understand, too, in this, chapter 22, you can't reason with those whose mind is set in stone and whose mind is made up. Saul, when he went to Nob, was convinced that the priest had betrayed him. When he went to Nob, his mind was made up going in. They were going to be put to death for helping David in a rebellion. And it didn't matter what was told him. or what they were trying to explain as to what happened, his mind was made up. You can't reason with somebody's mind set in stone. Until you get them to understand that they could be wrong, then you're not going to be able to talk to teach or instruct somebody if their mind's fully set in stone. So you've got to let people understand that they could be wrong, and then that's when you can explain to them. If Saul had understood there's a chance you could be mistaken, then he would have been more willing to listen. Then we see in chapter 23 the importance of good friends, that Jonathan had strengthened David's hand in God or encouraged him. We see the importance of having good friends. And we also see the importance of showing respect to those in authority. And we talk about, in the New Testament, those that were there told to show respect in 1 Peter, and Nero was the emperor. But you think about David here, who Saul is trying to kill him, and yet he shows him the respect that is due him for the office he holds. This shows us the importance of showing respect to those in authority. Next week we'll cover chapters 25 through 27, along with 1 Chronicles 8 and 9.